Well, let's begin. Let's welcome once again Professor Henrik Williams of Uppsala University.
Thank you. This time I will be talking about Runestones American style, and you might all expect me to at least mention the Kensington Runestone, which I will, but only now. It is, after all, the world's most famous, some would say infamous runestone, but talking about it would in itself take a whole time, so perhaps we can do that some other time. But I would like to show you that there is more, much more in North America than one would expect. And I'll try to see if I can, my PowerPoint doesn't seem like it wants to do anything here. There.
There we go.
Okay, so as of May 2022, I have identified no less than 107 objects from North America which bear runes or have been claimed to do so. They're spread over a wide area, no less than 31 states, including the District of Columbia, plus 5 Canadian provinces. Of these 107, 44 definitely carry runes. Those, almost all of them, are either modern and or memorial inscriptions, meaning that either they're very much inscribed to commemorate something identifiable, so you know that it's contemporary, or you can prove that they're modern in some other way. 8 of these inscriptions so far are definite copies of some other runestone or old text or something. And 5 inscriptions, I cannot definitely point to saying that this is copy or this is modern. I don't believe any of them are very old. The oldest inscription I've been able to identify so far is from 1887. But I would, and I hope to show you that because they're not that old doesn't mean that they're valueless or that they're uninteresting. I've divided this material into a number of, 11 categories, which we shall pass through rather quickly. The first one is seek and you shall find. A lot of runologists are quite upset. The Americans believe that there are runic inscriptions of the authentic kind in the United States and Canada. But actually, this is all our own fault, because one of the first the first runologist called Christian Raffen, a Dane, who published Antiquitates Americanae, which was a more or less a propaganda for the idea that Scandinavians were the first Europeans to discover America, which they were, yes, but at that time there was no concrete proof, only Icelandic sagas. People didn't necessarily believe in those days, so they tried to come up with all kinds of corroborating evidence. And one of these things was the Dighton Rock in Massachusetts that you may be acquainted with, which bears a lot of inscriptions, and some of these are rune-like, and Raffen claimed that there actually was runic inscriptions on this rock. We don't believe there is, but there it is. So that's actually what started off this whole thing, and it in itself spiked a joke from this Frank Cohen, who published something in a newspaper claiming that he'd found a runic inscription outside DC at the Potomac with this wonderful poem, and it's all a sham. I mean, there's nothing to it. But this was poking fun actually at Raffen and the people believing in him. But of course, you can read about these things in what's her name? The Search for Origins. What's that? But the author escapes me at the moment. Perhaps I'll think about it. But and then there are inscriptions that have been claimed. There was the French explorer Vendry, or however his name is pronounced, and he was claimed to have found a stone with inscriptions somewhere in the Dakotas, And this was taken eventually to Paris, and then it's disappeared. And there was some kind of inscription there that looked like it was a Tartar-inspired inscription. And those letters look something like runes. So there's been this rumor that that was actually a runestone, but we have absolutely no evidence whatsoever, and it's never been found since, unfortunately. Then this tiny little pebble, which is kept in the museum in Minneapolis, the Roseau stone, very, very tiny, as you can see. And these symbols here very much look like they could be inscribed, they could be writing, but actually it's probably just a geological formation of some kind, or possibly a fossil. I've looked at it personally, and it's not runes, that much I'm certain of. Whatever it is, that's for somebody else to discover, geologists probably, but it's not runic, at least, even though it's been claimed to be so. Then we have the Newport Tower, very famous. It's been claimed to be a Viking remain, and on over one of the lintels there is a stone. I've examined that myself with a ladder, which you can see in the background there, and me pointing towards where the stone was at, and the stone itself is down here, and there are some scratches here. It was hard for me to determine whether these are man-made or caused by some natural, vibrations or whatever. But what I could say, they have been claimed to read either I and K, or possibly a dotted N and a dotted K, and both of these would either be ink or eng, but in fact, it's not so. That's not what it says. So whatever they are, they're not runic, and the jury is still out if they're even made by man or not.
Pardon me for just a second. Your mic might be scratching something.
It could be, yeah. I'll divest myself of this thing, and I think that was probably the zipper of that. Is this in a better?
That does sound clearer.
Okay, good. I'll just freeze to death instead. More people keep being added here, so I constantly get floating controls, but I'll get rid of that. So then we have the Bourne stone in Massachusetts, which has some kind of symbols. It's known from pretty far back. It's obviously a very old artifact. And in the middle here, you can see what looks like an H, an O rune from the older Futhark, and possibly a Z rune. And then there's an X, which means that's a G in the old type. There's a P looking thing here, which could be a W in the old Futhark. But this is very likely some kind of pictograph, Native American origin. They were present in this area at the time when this probably was made, I would guess in the 17th century. I've looked at this myself too, and it would be very strange to have all of these other symbols together with the runes. So I don't think that is runic at all, actually. Then we have something that is definitely man-made, probably fairly modern. I mean, we're talking the last few centuries. These are letters of some kind, but are they runic? They have been claimed to do so. It's the Turley Hill inscription, very inaccessible. You need a guide to find it. I was there, and you can see that some of these letters or symbols, for example, here looks like an S rune, very much. And this, the first thing, the X here again could be a G rune in the older Futhark, but the rest of these are definitely not runic. They have, I think this has a meaning of some kind, but I've never been able to figure out what it is. So if anybody has any idea, I would be grateful to hear that.
Almost looks like Cherokee syllabary.
I haven't actually looked. I'm familiar with the existence of these, but do they look like that?
Some of the letters look like Cherokee syllabograms to me. Okay. I wonder if that's what it is. There are, of course, Cherokees in Oklahoma.
Yes, there are. It's definitely something I'll follow up and see if I can find the syllabary. I've looked at it once, but I've forgotten what they look like. They were, of course, inspired by European letters, but it's, as you say, a syllabary, and you know, whatever looks like one letter has no bearing phonetically to that letter at all. Chicoya just used that as the basis to create this writing, and I heard this. I don't know if it's an anecdote or if it's truth that it spread extremely quickly and was very, very popular, and the braves even went away from home for the pleasure of being able to write letters back. So that's nice, the power of writing. So then we come to the largest sample and these new inscriptions. I would say that runes are being carved every bit as much today as they were in ancient times. This particular runestone stands outside the American Swedish Institute in Minneapolis. It is carved by Viking Vemmenhög, the man in the mantle there, the blue mantle. And it's to commemorate and honor the immigrants, the Swedish immigrants that made it to Minnesota. And there is no secret about this at all. It's a very nice runestone, inspired by an Icelandic genuine runestone. And this man is very careful to make the runes on the stone proper and to check with authorities that it's proper runic Swedish as well, which is quite rare. Most people carving modern runestones carve them in modern English or modern Swedish. Here is another new runestone, one that I have written. If you want to read more about this, I have a blog entry. You can see more about this. I'll do it very quickly. It was found in, I think, 2011 by some mountain climbers, the Mustang Mountains. We're not talking the Alps, the Himalayas here, but it's a steep climb. I was up there. It's the highest I've ever been. I got in a bad fight with a cactus and lost, unfortunately. They found this stone and they reported it to Scott Walter, who is what I would call, well, the Donald Trump of runology. Of course, these runes, he said, are Old English runes, and he had somebody who's not a runologist come up with an interpretation, claiming that it was carved by a man called Peter Heurich, and that was a name that he identified in a record from Staffordshire in England around the year 1200. And from this, Scott Walter spun a tale where this Peter Heurich made it to Arizona looking for lead and silver ore and died here, and obviously had a companion who carved this wonderful runestone for him in this cave in the Mustang Mountains. And they made an hour-long show on his TV series. And so I ran into this and I thought about it for a little while. The runes there are very clearly carved. There was a discussion on the internet. People couldn't quite make it out because one of the runes was used in a very unfamiliar fashion. But as I've seen that used somewhere else, it wasn't that difficult for me to find out that what it says is not anything about any Peter Heurich, but in fact, this is what it says. I don't know if any of you have ever seen this language. Kails as sudins pesa runans, pashka astmais emens. And how can I translate that? Well, it was not a language that I recognized, but I did some more surfing on the internet, and I ran across a website ran by a man that claims that it's Sudovian. Now, Sudovian is an actual language. It's a Baltic language related to Latvian and Lithuanian, but it went extinct already perhaps in the 17th or 16th century. And we have very few remains. And this man has reconstructed the language and filled it out. And he claims that these Sudovians actually were in contact with Vikings and picked up runic writing from them. And his name, the website owner, is Joseph Pashka. He claims he did not carve this inscription. You may believe that or not, but he claims that he knows that it was done in 1993. So it's not at all an old Englishman from the year 1200, but rather somebody else in 1993. So this is definitely a modern inscription. But stuff like this gets passed around and made as a basis a claim that Europeans made it before. It's always people before Columbus for some reason. I don't know who didn't make it to America before Columbus. Everybody did, obviously, from Europe. And the Chinese and the Hebrews and so forth. So let's go to the next category here, and it's a fake runestone. I'm very hesitant in calling things fake, because in order for something to be fake, it needs to have been carved to deceive. And I think that most inscriptions, including the Kensington Runestone, I don't think that is a fake. I think it was, you can say that it's possibly a, I don't know, something's happening. When people come in here, that sort of messes up my thing. This anyhow was carved by a Swedish-American farmer in near Barrett Lake, Minnesota. It's not too far from Kensington, and the runes here are definitely Kensington runes. And it says year, or rather år, 1886, for Mojar, or maidens camped on this knoll, and it was found on a little hill where young people used to sit out and be romantic. And when they first found it, or was first reported by this farmer, people looked at it and nobody really believed that it was true, but they actually decoded the dating of the stone as 1376. And of course, that related to the Kensington Runestone, which is claimed to be from the same century. But finally, someone came up with the right. And then somebody asked this man, did you by any chance carve the stone? And he said, yes, I did. And I said, well, why did you say so? And he's claimed to have said, well, nobody asked me. So that's, it was fond of young women. And this, notice the heart-shaped. It's found in a small county museum in a nearby town, and I very much recommend it. It's a beautiful little piece. And as I already showed you, the second one, this is found in Oklahoma, which houses the second most runestones in America, I would say, after Minnesota. I looked at it a couple of times. The marks here are very fresh. The stone was found by young boys. It spells out M and then a rune that is almost never ever used, and we're not actually sure exactly what it meant. Sometimes it stands for a vowel and sometimes for a consonant, and it's sometimes transliterated E with 2 dots over, whatever that is supposed to mean, or an I with 2 dots over, or various other ways, and then D-O-K. And there was a Welsh prince in the 12th century who was claimed to be one of all these people who went across to the United States. And I'm wondering if this could be some kind of attempt to render his name in runes and claim that this is evidence that he made it to Oklahoma. But that is just a guess. I'm pretty sure that it's a fake, but I put a question mark because is it meant to deceive anybody? That's something I can't answer. So perhaps I shouldn't put it under fake at all. Then we come to copies, and there are a fair few number of those. And this one had us really bothered for quite a while. I was made aware of it quite early, and I couldn't make neither head nor tails of it. It's just nonsense. Some of the runes look strange and so forth. And I was just one of many other professional runologists who just could not come to grips with this. But in 2013 or in 14, a doctoral student in runology, Jonas Nordby, and an amateur, Buford Abelt, Texan, unfortunately passed away in the pandemic, both independently came up with the solution to this problem. And it made us all ashamed because you people, lots of you have seen this inscription in real life, or you have seen the source of this inscription. And where is it from? Well, I'll show you. It's from a book. And here I've taken a snippet out from the book, from the inscription as shown there. And you can, when you compare it to the actual inscription, you can see this is exactly the same inscription. But it's not the complete thing, because in the book you have 3 columns, and on the stone it's interrupted in the first line of the second column. And so what is the book? Well, it's this book, A Journey to the Center of the Earth, where the German professor finds the manuscript by Snorri Sturluson, where he claims to have found the way to the center of the earth, and it's written in runes, and this is the inscription. So someone sat down in San Antonio, Texas at some point and started copying out this inscription. It's a beautiful little piece, but it's not. Since the book was published in English in 1871, I would say that it's probably later than that. So that brings me to the final category, and in a way the most exciting to me, because this is the Heathener runestone in Oklahoma. Some of you may have heard of that. It's pronounced Heathener, not Heathener. It's huge, as you can see, absolutely huge. And those letters are foot high, the runes. And it was known fairly early. We have definite record from the 1920s when a man sent in a report to the Smithsonian asking them if they knew what this was about. And the woman standing there, Gloria Farley, she made it her career to prove that this stone was genuine. And she claims that there was another report already in the 1870s, which I think is possible. But I haven't seen absolute binding evidence of that. She also claims that there are oral history claiming that the Choctaws, the local tribe at the time, result of the Trail of Tears when Native Americans were moved, or I should say Indians, because in Oklahoma, Native Americans are called Indians. They were forcibly removed from Florida then to Oklahoma to reserve there. And at this particular area, there were Choctaws. And that there are rumors that they would have seen this inscription in the 1830s. For various reasons. First of all, it's very difficult to prove this. We're working on that. And I very much doubt it for several reasons. So what does the inscription say? Well, one reading, the second rune here doesn't look like a rune from the older alphabet. And it can either be an N rune reversed and just single-sided. And the very last rune would either be a short twig T rune or a reversed L rune. I would guess the latter. Actually, what gives the most meaning if it says Gnumedal, which is actually a Norwegian word, using the English word gnome, so it's a fairly modern, important to Norwegian, and it's used for a little valley. But there are other inscriptions or other interpretations of this inscription. Richard Nielsen, who wrote a lot about this and believed that it was genuine, read it as Glomedal and meant that there was the valley of this Glome. It doesn't at all look like the language. But the problem is here that these are older runes from the older Futhark. And some of these runes have never been used in an inscription after the year 700, or at the very latest 800. And if this were an inscription from that time, it would presuppose, first of all, that they wrote something that was not really interpretable, which is possible because not all inscriptions from that time are interpretable. It also would presuppose that people who had just discovered the art of sailing over oceans made it all the way to Oklahoma, which I personally find it difficult to believe. However, the stone itself is set in I would almost call it a ravine. It's an incredible place, very inaccessible. And this is my problem, because even though I cannot for the life of me believe that this is an 8th century or 9th century runestone, it's also very difficult to determine this stone as being a modern product, because first of all, the knowledge, if it was that as old as it's been claimed to be, at least from the 1870s, who would have knowledge of runes in this area at the time? There were no Scandinavians whatsoever here at that time, and quite few people altogether. And some of the runes here have a very special shape that I think they are to be found in the corpus edition by George Stevens, who was a runic dilettante, but published some beautiful volumes of runic inscriptions in 1867 and onwards. And he comments on some of these runes, and he has these particular shapes, not this runestone, of course, but these are runes here. So it's possible for someone to be inspired by that book. But that book, on the other hand, is a huge folio volume that must have cost an absolute fortune. And who in Oklahoma had access to it? So I'm more and more leaning against it to the theory that Martians probably carved this, because it's inexplicable as an ancient runestone. It's also very difficult to explain as a modern one. So as I said, the jury's out on that one. And it does, however, there have been books written about this runestone, and it plays a huge role in some people's imagination. And it illustrates something that worries me a bit, and that is how runes are used in various settings. This particular stone is a centerpiece of a painting by Sonia Aries, a local artist that it's difficult to find any information about. This is a picture I took myself of when the stone or the picture was exhibited. You can see in the background here that these Choctaw Indians cast shadows, and two of them then have obvious Viking, with horned helmets, implying that Choctaws actually have Viking background. And this is a topic that has been topos, I would say, that's been raised also when it comes to the Kensington Runestone, that people who believe that the stone is actually from the 14th century are claiming that the people who carved the stone then mixed with the Mandans, a local in Native American tribe, and somehow that the genes from these Mandans are supposed to be blonde and blue-eyed and all that. And I see this very much as cultural appropriation. I don't think that Sonia Aries had any, it was not meant to disparage Indians at all. But, you can use this for various sinister purposes, as has been done, claiming that all achievements by Native Americans are really because they have had some kind of European influence, or that they were the ones who taught Native Americans to do things like building their mounds, for example. For a long time, no one believed that the Native Americans actually constructed those mounds. So it's basically a racist discourse that I, as a runologist, feel that it's very unfortunate that what I love has been used in such a context. But mostly it's innocent. People play around with these things, and that I think is to be encouraged. So this was just a brief run through to give you some taste of what can be found in the United States, and I'm open to questions.
Well, thank you very much. Those who have questions, feel free to use chat, or to, if you'd like to just pipe up with your own audio. Chat is probably a little bit easier just for the flow. So by the way, I've never seen any of these in the flesh. There's a guy in Morrison, Colorado, who says that he has one on his property, but
you go out. I want to see that. So that's your duty till next time.
Well, he wants $20, and I just don't want to pay $20 to see his fake runestone.
he wants you to pay to look at the runestone.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm like, yeah, this is.
Could you find out at least what he claims, what it says, and more exactly where it's at? Because
I'll dig a little bit. It's been a couple of years.
Yeah.
But
what happens otherwise is that people, they find these things, and they're made the basis of stories that spread. And once those stories have spread, it's awfully difficult to put things back into the sack.
Oh, you're right about that.
So we have lots of questions here.
Yeah, see, Kim asks, how much does archaeological dating come into play with these stones?
Well, that's a problem, because usually you would like some kind of archaeological confirmation of something, either that it's old or it's new. And as far as I know, there have been no real archaeological confirmation. The only archaeological remains that we have of a Scandinavian settlement, of course, is Lancel Meadows at Newfoundland. There's been a penny found in Maine. Some people claim that's been left by Scandinavians. Some people claim that Indians have acquired it in trade. But as far as I know, there's absolutely no, they've tried to dig around the Kensington Runestone. I was there once with a man with one of those, what are called dowsing rods. And we walked across the property, and he claimed that it would dip down where he would find the bodies buried of the people that were killed in the Kensington raid. Now, my dowsing rod didn't dip, and I asked him why, and he said, well, you don't concentrate enough. So, but he hasn't been allowed to dig for the bodies yet, so I don't know. But it's a good question. That's what you would like to find. But on the other hand, I try to keep an open mind. People say that it's impossible for Scandinavians to come to the United States before Columbus. Well, deep into the United States. I think almost anything is possible, humanly possible. And it could be one-off. Some people, for some reason, made it into the heart of America, left something behind, never had any habitation. There is nothing else to find, and either just disappeared or went back. I mean, that's a possibility. As a runologist, I would have to say that looking at the inscriptions, we haven't found a single one that looks like it was actually left in old times by people who knew runes. And that is the smoking gun when it comes to the Kensington stone, that runes don't add up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I did a analysis of the Kensington Runestone for a video on my channel, just looking at how the runes don't match up with the language used, with the time that's stated on it, and it just doesn't make sense even as a forgery.
Yeah.
But I agree with you that it's part of what's frustrating about it is that it's not impossible that somewhere in North America there is a runestone carved by Norse speakers before Columbus. It's not in the realm of utterly impossible, but it's just that none of the ones that have been quote unquote found are.
But could I add
plausible.
2 things? First of all, I would never expect to find a runestone in North America for the simple reason that for some reason Scandinavians did not carve runestones when they went west. There are very few on the Faroe Islands. There are none on Iceland, this huge Viking habitation. There are none on Greenland. There are runic inscriptions, but they simply quit making runestones. Now, there are very few in Norway in the Viking Age for some unknown reason, and that made most people, the Vikings, most of them came from Norway going west, so that may be their explanation, that it was simply out of fashion where they went. Secondly, if Vikings ever settled on the east coast of the United States, that would probably be very near the beach or the shoreline. And since there is heavy coastal erosion in northeast New England, the risk is that actually such traces would have disappeared by now, because I think at least 100 yards or more has disappeared since the Viking Age. So that's, if you find anything, it would be some kind of loose objects. That's what I would, wood or bone or something, or metal. That's what I would expect.
Well, and then it's tough to prove that a loose object wasn't planted there, right? Like with the penny. Whereas,
yeah, that's true. There are a couple of authentic runic inscriptions. They're modern, but they're Scandinavian. But they were brought about with immigrants coming to the United States, and such an implement can, for example, outside Chicago, Waukegan is a suburb. They found a horn, beautiful horn made of ivory, I think. It had a beautiful runic inscription. And, the find spot, it was in a mound of dirt, so it could very well be an archaeological find, but of course it was picked up and no excavation was done. But actually it was brought up by some Icelandic immigrants, because they could actually find the artist and the sketches to the horn, and it was made in the 1920s. So there is that problem, yes. Now, we're not answering the questions here. They're popping up.
No. Let's see. Steph asked a question that was similar to Kim's that I think you've covered. Magdalena asks, has the Choctaw Nation offered their opinion on the Oklahoma runestones?
I am ashamed to say that I have talked to people with Indian background, and they're quite interesting. They're helping out with the research on this. I don't know the nation that they represent. If it's a Choctaw, there are a number of nations in Oklahoma at this point. I was at this University of Central Oklahoma, and there's a Dr. Randall Ice there, and there are several other people who are involved with, especially the Heathener runestone, to try to find out what can be there. And they're looking at missionary records and tribal records, what they are, and they seem to be, they're very positive and constructive here. So they're looking into this, but they haven't been able to confirm anything yet.
Lorian asks, the Hunisad picture stone rediscovered in 2020 had to be easy to verify because there's documentation describing it. What would be your process to determine the authenticity of a find?
Well, first of all, as a runologist, I would look at the runes themselves. They would have to be consistent with what you would either with just internally, because they don't necessarily have to mean anything. People carved runic inscriptions that don't have a lexical meaning to us. But the runes would still have to add up. You can't mix runes from, say, 1,000 years apart. That doesn't work. And if that's why many of the inscriptions from the United States don't have meaning, I think because it's very risky. Carving runes is quite easy. You look them up in a dictionary or whatever, or an encyclopedia. But if you try to write Viking age language, that is extremely hard to make that authentic looking. So if we would find an inscription that has genuine Old Norse of some kind, runic Swedish or Old Icelandic, whatever, and the runes added up from the time of the language, because the language changes quite a lot, so we can date it roughly, that would convince me whether or not there were any archaeological or historical sources confirming it.
I need to figure out how to carve stone better then.
There's that too, but it could be one-off. It could be some guy who's absolutely desperate and just wants to carve something. But again, even you who know a fair bit of Old Norse, I think you would have a hard time fooling me if you tried to present me with a fake inscription.
I'm sure. One of the things that I think is so interesting about Michael Barnes' book, Runes, a Handbook, is that he goes into the physical process of carving. Mm-hmm. And I can see how someone who has a good eye for that sort of thing could tell, this looks like a medieval chisel stroke versus a modern, chisel or scribe or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and now we're doing laser scans of inscriptions, so we're finding out more information that way. But first of all, we need to remember that the steel in the Viking Age was pretty good. It was every bit as good as things were in the early 19th century, for example. So I think it would be hard to distinguish with something carved in 1910 and the year 1010 necessarily. And again, yes, sometimes we're left to that kind of argument that this doesn't quite look. For example, we have a pot shard here in Uppland, which was found in 1963 in some excavation. And when the student presented to the professor said, this is a fake. Okay, so it was just discarded. But then it was refound 20 years later, and someone said, no, wait a minute, this thing was actually inscribed before the ceramic was fired, or whatever you call it. So that had to be done before, and the urn itself is old. So then it was authentic for a while. And then recently, we looked at it again, and someone said, well, it was probably soft, even though it was ceramic, it was probably soft after being buried in the ground for 1,500 years. So probably easy to carve runes into it at that point anyway, as a joke. And the runes don't look the way we would like them to do. And it's just 4 runes that don't mean anything. So we're back now to thinking there was a practical jokes by the students trying to fool their professor. But the jury's been...
That's a warning about how those
tread carefully. Yes, and you should never claim to know more. I'm disturbed by the fact that a lot of my colleagues have been very, for example, when the Kensington Runestone appeared, they said it's a fake, it's an obvious fake. Well, they didn't know that much about runes it claims to be from 1362. At the time, there were almost no inscriptions, other runic inscriptions from the 14th century at all to compare with. So how would they know what an inscription looked like in 1362? Now we have like 150 of them from the 14th century. So, and none of them look at all like the Kensington Runestone. So that's very much an argument against its authenticity. But people were just too quick to judge here and quite dismissive. And I would say even, it was I don't know what word to use here. lack of respect
Hmm.
of the people, because you find something you think is a runestone, you present to the specialist and they treat you with contempt. That only breeds then a counter contempt of science. And that is one of the greatest problems we have now, anti-intellectualism and fake history.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't seem to be able to counter that very effectively.
Well, and actually, Stella's comment here, I think, is very connected to this. Stella points out that my video about the Kensington Runestone gets some of the most aggressive or abusive comments of any video on my channel.
Yes.
I hope that I don't seem too contemptuous. I don't mean to be contemptuous of someone who I guess doesn't know better how to judge the evidence. But perhaps my contempt or dismissiveness of someone who would want to pull the wool over someone else's eyes shows through, and people feel that. I don't know, but you're right. I mean, it's worth it to try to remain compassionate toward people who are misled. They're not deliberately misled. That's a point that Carl Sagan makes a lot about pseudoscience. So
well, the
I appreciate
mongers
the reminder.
of disinformation, they're the ones that deserve the contempt. But the problem is, if we show that contempt to them, people who support them feel that that contempt is handed on to them, who are just misguided.
Yeah, you're right. You're right, and that's a reminder for me too in presenting about these things. Let's see. Kim asks, swinging back to the talk of other runic finds, have there been any that are nearby any of these disputed stones that have helped decipher date or answer any questions about the stones in a time frame of Viking contact with the area, such as in Lansa Meadows on the northern tip of Canada's Newfoundland?
Not really. First of all, runic finds are, even though they are more than 100, I'd say, that they're spread over most of the United States. So most of these are just singular finds, and they don't really have a context at all. There is a little bit. One of the stones I didn't show you seems like it could be a copy of the Heathener stone. So that would be one of those, but it doesn't look at all as good as the Heathener stone does. It looks very recently carved, and it was found again by boys playing it somewhere. So I'm when I lecture about these things, I say every stone has a story. You want things to corroborate the setting. I mean, runestone is part of an entire cultural phenomenon, right? And we have nothing in the United States as yet that proves that Scandinavians were there before Columbus. And so it's very hard to relate these plain runes to any such historical or archaeological or any other data. And one of the problems is that people, as you said, you haven't seen none of these. People just don't know about them. And when somebody finds, there was a woman in West Virginia, I believe, who found a runestone when she was a girl, and she wrote to 10 different institutions, including the Smithsonian Institution, asking for information. She never even received an answer. At least that's what she claims. And I think that part of the reason is because there are no experts in the United States. After all, there are no runologists in Maine, as Einar Haugen has claimed to said once. So how are they don't believe that this is authentic, but on the other hand, they really can't present the evidence. So what I'm trying to do is just assemble a corpus of these inscriptions, present them with the basic facts that I have, as much information as possible, so that people at least have something to refer to. And if it will be either published or just put out on the internet, I don't know that yet. But
well, and you're right. I hadn't thought about this. In terms of runology, despite a PhD in Scandinavian studies, I'm basically self-taught in runology, right? It was not something covered in my graduate program, and it's not well covered in any graduate program I can think of in the US.
Well, part of that is because most of these Old Norse studies is about Old Icelandic, right? And even though there are very few original sources from Western Scandinavia, including Iceland, from the Viking Age, 80% of all the original sources from the Viking Age are Swedish runestones. And since they don't offer, or people don't think that they offer as much interesting information, they're very rarely made part of the curriculum, which I think is a great pity. And that's one of the thing I'm trying to spread the runic gospel, that these are the sources to go to, and they give a lot more than you think they would.
Well, you've spread it to me. I've taken a huge interest in this stuff. So
that is, I'm glad. At least I have one convert.
Yeah, well, you do, for whatever it's worth. Lauren asks, are picture stones equally difficult to verify, equally difficult as written runestones?
They're even worse, I would say, because how do you verify the interpretation of a picture? And I shouldn't really speak to this topic because I'm no specialist on pictures at all. Actually, I'm rather handicapped. I don't have good visual memory and so forth. There are other people who are much better than me here, but picture stones don't often, well, there are pictures on runestones, right? And sometimes we can interpret those. And the ones that we can interpret seem to be referring to episodes in Icelandic sagas. Sigurd the Dragon Slayer, for example, occurs on a number of runestones, and Thor and the slaying of the Midgard serpent and so forth. Various other pictorial representations, we're uncertain of what they refer to. Then there are the pure picture stones, if she's talking about those. And they're usually before the Viking Age. Most of them are from Gotland, from perhaps the migratory age or slightly later than that. And I know as much about those as the next guy. That is nothing. So I really can't give a good answer, and I should acknowledge the limits of my knowledge here.
Makes sense. Stella asks, just since I don't think everyone knows about it and I find it very cool, would you be willing to talk a little about your own American inscription at the Viking Stadium in Minneapolis?
Yeah. This was back in 2015, I believe, and the Minnesota Vikings, which happened to be the American football team that I rooted for because my first year in the United States was in 1976, 77. I was there as an exchange student, and I discovered American TV, American football, and peanut butter. So I would be sitting there with a huge jar of peanut butter, eating that and watching the games and just loving it. And of course, Minnesota Vikings, having the most Scandinavian background, was the one that so when they contacted me in 2015, that was kind of nice. And what they were building a new stadium in Minneapolis, and they were going to take this Viking imagery and use that in various ways. And I don't know what you call it, the commercial department, they come up with these inscriptions, and one was going to be placed in the bow of a concrete Viking ship that they have built outside the stadium. I don't know if any of you have been there. It's a wonderful stadium, and they have this half Viking ship sticking out there. And in the bow, there is this runestone. And then this one guy happened to pass by and said, well, where do you get the runes? And they said, well, we found it on the internet somewhere. And they said, would you give me a week? Because this guy happened to have a BA in archaeology, to just check that we're not making fools of ourselves. And then he Googled runology and professor, and he happened upon my name. And what transpired eventually, that I was allowed to consult on everything dealing with runes. The plaque here, which has their team's motto, what is it now? I forget. Honor your legacy, defend the North, something like that. It sounds slightly racist to me, but fine. So I put that in proper Old Norse and came up with a set of runes that are authentic enough, but would still prove to any runologist that they are a made-up set, because I don't want them to look too genuine, all right? So they use that there, and they have these, what they call runestones, little monoliths standing around, that have they have this war cry, skull, which they claim comes from skull, because they would be drinking mead out of the enemy's skulls. And that's all a joke, of course, because skål in Swedish means bowl, and they would be say a bowl for this and that, and then just a bowl. So they would play around with these things, and I was able to consult on that. And I actually wrote a little series that they published the first year, and all their home games, 8 of them, they had in their magazine or their program. There was a little series there called The Truth Behind. And it was done the various things, like they have this big, huge horn, the Gjallar horn, that they blow whenever, they start a game and whenever there's a touchdown and so forth. So I gave them a story about the Gjallarhorn, which is, taken from Old Norse myth, of course, and the various other things, Viking women, for example, Viking shields and so forth, and runes. So that was nice. And it's still out there somewhere. You can find it on their homepage, buried very deeply, but it's still. So that was a chance of disseminating some proper information.
Yeah, I remember when you and I were in Minneapolis.
Yeah, we get the link here from Stella.
Stella always finds this thing.
Yeah.
When you and I were in Minneapolis for SAS a few years ago, I remember we went to was it a banquet? Was it the American Scandinavian Foundation or something where you were talking about this and showed some pictures?
Was it the women's club, perhaps?
Oh, maybe it was that.
Yeah, I think so.
I can't remember now. It was 2016 or 17. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we've taken about an hour of your time.
Yeah, but don't go ahead. As long as there is a question, I'll answer.
Okay. Let's see. Kim asked, let me make sure that I'm understanding this question. So runic writing seems to have cast a spell on many of us and keeps getting used in homage or for attention or simply for fun. Are there other, I guess, historical languages that have such a high volume of modern usage?
That's a good question. Some, like hieroglyphs, are just too complicated to be used, and the same comes with cuneiform is also just too difficult. I think the runes, my first doctoral student was an Australian, Mindy McLeod in Melbourne, who's the most critical person I ever met. She doesn't buy into anything at all. I asked her once, why are you so fascinated with runes? And she gave a simple answer: because they look neat. And I think that is, runes are close enough to our letters that they are familiar, yet they are unfamiliar enough. So they sort of elicit a sort of fascination with something that is familiar but yet strange. I think that is a huge part of the reason why people. Then, of course, they're rare. You don't see them very often. They have not been overused, perhaps, as much, or abused as much else. People, and again, there are letters, so you can spell out things. When it comes to Chinese writing or Japanese writing, that people sometimes have, some people have tattoos with Chinese writing, and it turns out they say soy sauce and stuff like that. Right. Of course, now runes, about half, or I would say 2/3 of all the questions I get about runes are people needing help with runic tattoos.
Yeah.
And we're forbidden to consult on that, so I don't help out. But it's you probably should ask somebody else, because as I think I told you that my own fascination with runes was quite late, and I think it's because the familiarity, they were just too common back in Sweden. It needed for me to go to the United States in the beginning of the 80s and meet with Elmer Antonsen there, who made me understand how unique these things are and how different they are from many other cultural aspects, because they're writing in a basically oral society. So once we get sort of an insight into oral culture through writing that we very rarely get otherwise, because otherwise literacy kills off oral culture, right?
Well, and an adjunct to what you were saying is, I think that part of what makes people so fascinated with the Elder Futhark in particular is just that it's called Elder, right? I think people, there's this sense that, oh, this is something primordial and especially old, something, quote, original. Even though mostly what people ask, because I get all these requests about tattoos and stuff too, what people mostly want is Old Norse, which does not work with Elder Futhark.
No.
Right. But getting people to understand that mismatch is very, very difficult. Quick follow-up question. Does the university forbid you from consulting on tattoos?
Yes, the legal departments, they're afraid that if I would consult and things would turn out wrong, we would be sued.
Yeah, that's part of why I don't do it too.
Yeah, but here in Sweden, we don't sue each other. So I think that's exaggerated. But on the other hand, it gives me reason not to.
Yeah, right. Sometimes it's just nice not to have to. Yeah, Stella says, every holiday I say I'm going to try to do that and recreate a runic inscription, but then I end up having too much work. You could make a hell.
You do that.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure I could even fool myself. It's because I can't carve runes. That's my first problem. I tried once and that was a catastrophe.
See, this is my problem too, is I'm thinking, I don't know. I mean, of people who could figure out the language and the runes themselves, I feel like I'd have a decent shot. It's just a physical process.
It's interesting to look at modern rune carvers, to runestone carvers, because they do a very good job and it looks beautiful. But yet straight away I can see that it's a modern carving because they're always too perfect.
Yeah.
Everything, because we have the sense everything needs to be exactly so, right? But in the Viking Age, they had a much more dynamic relationship to their carving, and they would, the surface of the stone, they would really utilize that because it would be uneven. And if you look at the lines, they're never parallel. They're always, but they somehow made it much more alive. Modern inscriptions they look dead, flat and dead.
You're absolutely right. This is part of what, to me, often makes a inscription just blare fake, is when it's just too perfect, right? The letters all look the same, right? It looks like a font, right? Whereas in real inscriptions, you have the same word spelled two different ways, or you have the same rune that's, flipped or not flipped. Yeah, you're right. It is a huge difference in how we perceive writing from how medieval.
The difference between handwriting and typing, I would say.
Yep. And we're such a typing focused culture that we tend to think that these products need to look sort of like typing. Yeah, I think that's well noticed and observed. Well, do we have other questions from the audience?
There are 38 chats down here.
Okay, there are some more people coming in. Saul asks if you know anyone who does consult on tattoos, and what if someone doesn't say it's for the tattoo? I'll just say my blanket response is just I don't do translations, right? Unless it's for some bigger thing, a movie, a video game, or whatever, like a larger project that I'm consulting on. I just don't do it because most of them are for tattoos.
No, I don't know anybody who is creditable and does this commercially. I don't think there is such a person right now, because those of us who know enough about this have too much other proper stuff to do. I'm sorry about that. But that's also because people aren't really prepared to pay for the humanities, right? If there was enough money, people don't go to a lawyer and ask them to consult on a will or something, and then says, either I expect to get this for free, I'll pay you $10.
Right.
But people, when I'm asked to come and talk or do something for people, nobody would ever say, well, I'll pay you $1,000, except for the Minnesota Vikings.
Well, there
they
you
paid me handsomely, so that was nice.
Yeah, I mean, if people were paying $1,000, it might change my mind.
We should add that it's incredibly hard to translate something from modern English into proper Old Norse.
Yeah.
Because the words and the concepts that we have now simply did not exist back then. So not only do you have to find a word that would be approximately right, you would have to sort of, how would they have expressed this if they had thought in this way?
Yep. I've tried to state that in numerous different videos. It is so hard to take the things that people want, these really abstract concepts. Like one of my favorite examples is people want things like strength and honor. Well, what kind of strength are we talking about? In Old Norse, typically you don't talk about, like, look at Havamal. He doesn't say like courage is, he says a brave man is, right? Typically you're not talking about those abstract concepts. You're talking about people with the quality.
Yeah.
So it's just not how Old Norse tends to phrase things. And then our abstract concepts are not very good matches with theirs. Like I have a really hard time knowing what word translates English honor very well. Drengskaper maybe, Orstir maybe, but those have very specific meanings in their home culture, right?
Perhaps, I don't know.
Maybe, yeah. But yeah, exactly. I think it's just too difficult to do convincingly, to convince myself with such a translation. Stell points to an inscription in Wyoming that I'll need to look into more about.
Yes, you do. I don't have any from Wyoming, I believe. I want to fill. I want one from every state. So come on, people. If nothing else, go out and carve one and report it.
All right. I'll see if I can cover Wyoming for you.
Yeah.
Margot says, why do you think there are so many runestones in Runrike? I don't know what Runrike is.
Are we talking about the Swedish? They call themselves the Runriket. It's around Vallentuna. Is that the one we're talking about?
Might be.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah. Well, first of all, the province of Uppland between Stockholm and Uppsala has the most runestones altogether. And I think there are two reasons for that. And that part of the reason is that people up here were rich at the time. Obviously, they were very successful in their trade more than raid, because most Swedes went east all the way down to Istanbul and served in the Emperor's Guard and so forth. So, and there were other resources. Obviously, I'm not an historian, so I don't know exactly about this, but they obviously, people had money, they had resources up here. So they had the money to pay for somebody who carved, because up here in this part of Sweden, the runestones are really professional. You have rune carvers who probably produced as many as 100 runestones. And so that must have been a professional career. And they are more artwork than, the inscriptions are not that important anymore. Secondly, the Christianization process seems like if it goes quickly, you don't have that many runestones, but if it goes slowly, you do. And Uppland we dragged our feet up here. People became Christian already in the late 10th century, but the sort of official conversion to Christianity was almost a century later. So there was 100 years of people, some families were Christian, others were heathen. I don't think there were a lot of controversy, actually. They claim, or historians like to claim, that there were all these conflicts, bloody conflicts between Christians and heathens. I see no evidence of that in runic inscriptions. I think it's simply a fashion coming when the Danish king Harald Gormson Bluetooth decided to convert in the 960s and had this wonderful runestone, the Yellingstone, raised. That sort of sparked the interest for runestones all over Scandinavia. And it ended up more or less here in Uppland. So why the Runriket? Well, obviously people were the richest right there, and they had the most or the best or was the highest fashion. It is very close to the political center as well. So I think all of these aspects. But of course, I'm speculating here. I should point this out, that I know none of these things. These are just likely explanations that I'm offering.
Well, and I think when you mentioned the lack of conflict, I'm surprised sometimes by very prominent inscriptions. I can't remember which one this is, but there's one that a big tall stone somewhere in Sweden that has images some people think represent Ragnarok, but also a big Christian cross.
Yes.
So there's some interplay there.
Yeah, I think that Christian missionaries, that's what you do. You come to a culture and you need to tell stories that people are familiar with. And they say, hey guys, you all know about the Ragnarök. You're all going to die pretty soon. So now this is actually going to happen because Christ is going to come back on doomsday, and you people better shape up. So they would use the heathen imagery and they would put that in a new Christian interpretation, and it would be working then both ways. That's what Christian missionaries did in Africa when they got there. And once people are on board and really are part of the Christian message, then you can sort of do undiluted Christianity, but that doesn't work at first.
Or look at the Heliond in Old Saxon.
Exactly.
Right, taking the story of Christ and putting it in the narrative of something like Beowulf. Yeah.
It's interesting to see that the crucifixion on the Yellingstone, there isn't even a cross. Christ is just standing there with his arms out. And I've been told that it isn't until when people are actually firmly Christian that you can tell people, okay, so our God died on a cross like a common criminal, because that did not at all rhyme well with a Viking Age hero worship.
Interesting. I hadn't thought about the image of him crucified. I'll have to look at that over time. That's a cool point. So Kim asks, and I hope I understand this question, is it possible that the Scandinavian runic language continues to evolve as the fascination with it and the cultures behind it are still quite vibrant, if not growing? So that kind of if I understand the question right, that the modern uses of runes continue
You're
to
saying
evolve.
a sort of revitalization process, almost like Hebrew or Latin, that it's being used, expanded, that you come up with new words and concepts. Is that what we're talking about here?
I see a yes in response.
Okay. Not to my knowledge. This may not be exactly what you're after, but I was recently in contact with a friend who's now on the Shetland Islands and very active in the Shetland, which is the local Scots language of English, right? It doesn't have the same roots as British English, but it has North English. And this Shetland it's fascinating. As a Swede, it's extremely easy to understand and read because it looks like a mixture between, and of course, Shetland and Orkneys were colonized by Scandinavians, and they made a huge impression on the Scots language that they spoke there. And now there is this revitalization process. They're trying to get this Shetland to be recognized as a viable language that people speak and encourage them. But then I asked them, is there no such movement of people trying to revive Norn, which was the Scandinavian languages of Shetland and Orkney that died out in the, well, at the very latest in the 19th century? And she said, well, there are some fanatics in the United States that try to, but nobody on Shetland. Don't worry. So.
Yeah, depending on when you asked, I might have been one of those fanatics in the US.
Perhaps she referred to you.
Steph asks, this is just a fun question, but say someone found what they thought was a runestone. Whom should they first contact?
Me.
Yeah,
if we're talking about an American runestone, ordinarily I would say contact the local authorities, but in this case, they don't seem to take much interest. But if you go, there is an association for the American Association for Runic Studies. The president is Lorraine Johnson. You can find her at runicstudies.org. On that website, you find various resources, among them a checklist that I have published there. What you do if you find a runic inscription in the United States. And be careful, that's one. Try to document, don't interfere. Don't clean it off. Don't remove it. I mean, any archaeologist would say that you destroy more than, well, perhaps 90% of the value of an object once you remove it from its context. Because if we're ever going to find an authentic runic inscription, you might very well ruin the evidence of that if you mistreat it when you find it. And if it's in likelihood, it's not going to be authentic, but that doesn't mean that it's valueless, because these inscriptions are created by humans every bit as valuable as the ones who did it 1,000 years back. And they had a reason for doing so. And I find that actually quite as interesting as I do with the authentic runic inscriptions. And the myths around them, I mean, that's wonderful. Just look at the Kensington Runestone. It's a cultural icon. It's an ethnic marker. How many Swedish runestones can claim that kind of meaningfulness, right? And the Heathener runestone has a little bit of that following it too. And I'm hoping that each and every runic inscription in the United States gets sort of a fan club and people.
Well, you're right. They do each have stories, and I hadn't thought about how much more prominent the Kensington Runestone is in the imagination of that local area of Minnesota than some incredible runic inscriptions are in Sweden that people just drive by. Yeah,
they do, because we get blind. You know, there are too many of them here. And I would have been nobody without the Kensington Runestone, because people, when I go to the United States, people don't come to listen to what I have to say about some podunk Swedish inscription. Basically, it's always the Kensington Runestone that draws the crowds, right? And the best crowd I ever had was in Alexandria, where the runestone is housed, where 250 people showed up to listen to me talking about it, even though there was a hockey game on at the same time with the Minnesota, whatever they're called.
Wow.
Yeah.
No, I believe you. You still have time for a few more questions?
Sure.
Richard asks, the Kensington stone had unusual runes that didn't quite make sense as a Viking Age inscription, but then it was discovered that it matched up with the kind of runes used by a small number of people in a certain part of Sweden as late as the 1800s.
Yes.
Can you tell us a bit about how that tradition of rune usage came to be, as far as we know, when it started and how it was kept alive?
No, we don't know that. We know that some people, first of all, authentic runic usage in Sweden more or less dies out around the year 1500. It has survived in some remote parts of the country. But in one province of Dalecarlia or Dalarna, we think that either was a revival, authentic revival, or there was a certain Lutheran priest who came there who was interested in runes and saw that they had a local culture of carving runes and sort of reformed that, expanded it to a proper alphabet, introduced some new runes and so forth. And these are called the Dalecarlian runes. And some people claim that the Kensington type of runes have evolved from the Dolly Carlene runes. So that's one theory, but we haven't been able, because there are enough differences to not quite, I'm not sure that is I believed that myself at first, but I'm not sure I do that anymore. And now we have found other Kensington type runes, and many of them come from another province of Härjedalen. Some people claim that that is the origin of this type of runes, but they all seem to start appearing in the 19th century. And it may very well be that someone sat down and came up with a new type of runic alphabet. And I have speculated where, if that runic alphabet was used by journeymen, people who were training for a trade, and they trained for a master, and then they had to go around in different places to meet up with other people before they became masters themselves. And these people would sometimes use secret writing to give each other messages, that this employer is a good guy, and this boy is stingy with food and so forth. But again, we don't have enough material as of yet. So it's very difficult. The only thing we can say is that we have no evidence that Kensington type runes existed before the 19th century. Everything points towards the Kensington Runestone being carved in the 19th century. I would say at the very end of the 19th century myself.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Max asks, are there any recent runic findings that are worth attention? I'll use the word game changers because I can't find any other proper term. Something that shines a new light on our present knowledge about runes.
Well, there have been quite a few finds of this Kensington type runes. Unfortunately, most of this has been written in Swedish. It's been above all Magnus Källström, who is the boss of the runic division of the National Antiquities Board here in Sweden. He's written a lot about that on his blog. If anybody reads Swedish, I highly recommend you to look at that. Other sensational finds, not very recently, no. But there's a type of material that didn't exist 100 years ago, which is recent to me, perhaps not to you. And that these are the type of runic plates, what we call them, small strips of metal carved with runes. And they can be, some of them very early Viking age, of copper or bronze. And Sonja Persvetov-Murat wrote her dissertation on that a few years back. And that was actually translated into English, and it's available on the internet for free, or you can, buy the book. So Runic Plates is what it's called, and it gives us entirely new insight into magic, healing, such things that haven't been present at all almost in other types of material, runic material. So that is it. And many of those finds we knew. I think we have now more than 100 of those, and from the Viking Age, and I think there was a single one known before the year 1900. They start appearing in various excavations in the 20th century.
I see Stella has the link. That's,
yes, wonderful.
I'm going to have to acquaint myself with that. I'm not well acquainted with this material.
It's a very good dissertation. I highly recommend it.
Thank you. And then Stella, by the way, thanks you for confirming about who to contact about rune finds. And the last thing I see is Elena commenting, I think, about Dalecarlian runes. I wonder if it was a cultural fashion similar to Greek or Roman follies in England during the natural landscaping phase circa Jane Austen's life.
Yeah, I mean, these things are fads, and runes are becoming more popular now than I've seen in my lifetime. I don't know exactly why that is. And a case in point is that in this series, The Vikings, that was televised, I guess a lot of you have seen it. I haven't watched it myself, but I take it that runes didn't play any part of that at all, or almost not at all. But this recent movie, The Northman, they actually went out of their way to consult on the runes with me. I heard rumors that you've been critical, and we're going to have a discussion on that, you and I, but let the rest of the people, because, I don't take that lightly.
I'm not critical of the runes. I was critical of the movie. No, that, okay. Well, actually, there was one rune thing that I was a little bit critical of. I'll tell you what it was. I'll tell you what it was. So the sword says Draugr,
yes,
but I thought, okay, but it says that in Elder Futhark. So I thought, well, if it's Elder Futhark, it should say Draugaz, right?
No, because you have the syncope in the 6th century. This was set then. I asked them, it was quite difficult to get them to set an actual date. So we're talking Viking Age, but very early Viking Age. And I had the older Futhark option there. They asked about that, if they could use that. Well, if you're around 800, yes. And in that case, you would have the syncope and would you not have the Draugaz. But I would agree with you afterwards that getting the older runes there wasn't the best choice, no. But, you know, these people weren't very communicative. They just said, we want this word transrunified.
Right.
Okay, right. So, and
I know how that goes.
I'm asking, you know, so who exactly is using it where? I had no idea how it was going to be used. I was just told this is the word runified.
No, I know exactly how this goes. I've worked on movies and video games and stuff too. That was my criticism, but I can see how, yeah, okay, if it's supposed to be at the very tail end of the Elder Futhark period, you could say, okay, the syncope is happened. Yeah. I guess there's inscriptions like the one, whatever the one is that says how the Wolofs or something has the syncope. Okay, so there are some late ones that have syncope. I'll give it to you. But I was
okay, there was something there about the sword. We had a chat there. I didn't.
BK Winter says the sword itself is from the 6th or 7th century from the design of it.
Okay, that was why I chose 6th or 7th century. Yes, older runes. Yes, syncope. Yes. So you stand corrected. Sorry.
I stand informed. I mean, my point was still that, like, I would have expected an older language form of the Elder Futhark, but okay, as you correctly state, you could see Draugs on a sword of that period. Yeah. But I was very positive about the younger Futhark in the chapter titles.
Okay, right? Good. I'm glad.
Well, but I thought that was great because it looks like that obviously is exactly the kind of runes I would expect in Norway or Iceland if you saw much in Iceland at about the time the movie is set. So I was very positive about that. Most of my critical comments were just that I didn't enjoy the movie, but that's a whole different matter.
Well, I've yet to see it because they didn't send me any tickets. So I'll have to buy some for myself. And I go there primarily to watch Alexander Skarsgård's six pack because I've seen the posters of him running around half naked. So that's, I don't particularly care for the violence myself.
Yeah, I mean, this is not for me, right? People can be, it can be a little bit of a Kensington Runestone situation, right? Where you say something like that and people get offended, like you're saying something about them. Like, I don't care if you like it. It just wasn't for me.
Yeah, well, it's been very positively reviewed here. So
really,
I'm not sure that's a compliment or not, but it's had good reviews so far.
It seemed mixed around here, but I don't know.
I always found it strange. Why do they have people speaking broken English to indicate that they're actually speaking another language? I thought that we got rid of that in the 50s, but it seems like it's coming back now.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Either they speak whatever language they spoke, which was Old Norse, that would be too difficult. Sometimes they have people speaking modern Icelandic, which does not sound like Old Norse, right, even though people seem to believe so, including the Icelanders themselves. But you know, if you make it credible, you make people sound perfectly native, even though they speak English, because that is how they would have sounded like to other people at that time.
Right. You have to sort of translate the accent in a sense, right? I mean, this is actually part of my translation philosophy. Is so many translators want to make things like the Poetic Edda sound old-timey, but to me, it's a better representation of what it says to make it sound contemporary because it was contemporary to the people who originated it.
Yes.
So I don't quite understand the old time, because the Northman actually uses some pretty old-timey English, and then everybody uses different accents. And I don't know. To me, it would just sound better if everybody used one type of, English accent or something, and just used more contemporary language. It would take me out of the movie less. But now we're veering away from runes and into movie criticism.
Yeah, we are.
So, not everything can be the Searchers. Just to state a movie I like. Other questions, comments, remarks? You've given us nearly an hour and a half of your time, which I really appreciate.
I'm just happy. Hey, you listen to me. Nobody else does, so I'm just happy to be part of this. But and if we've missed any questions that you want answered, you can write to me directly. That's fine too.
Well, that's very kind of you. And you'd be surprised how much I listen to you. I mean, I've become, especially in the last decade, extremely interested in runology, and a big point behind my channel is to point people toward good resources about this stuff. And you're one of the best resources out there. So, I mean,
well, thank you very much. I'm very flattered. And you know, I love an American audience because they're more interested and more into this than, for some reason, than Swedes are. I couldn't be bothered, most of them, but it's.
I've noticed that. Well, we'll have to, I'm looking forward to looking at some stones with you in late August.
I'll be here. I'll meet you then.
I'm looking forward to it. Still says, comment, I did also want to thank you because I read a review you did on a certain runic author once, and the points at the end on public engagement really stuck with me.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you for your time. And
thank you. Hope to see you again.
Yeah. See you in a couple months in Sweden.
Okay. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye,
Thanks for listening.